Okay, Weimar Republic. Again, quite a few videos on this one. It's quite a big topic. It features very heavily in the course. We're talking here about the early years of the Weimar Republic and primarily talking about the economic problems that it faced in its early years up to 1921. So, economic problems weren't the only ones. There were other problems the Weimar Republic faced. Firstly, there were the inherent weaknesses of the Weimar Constitution, which there's a video on. It's quite long. Bear with it. There's also the lack of support for the Weimar Republic from both the left, the Spartacists, and the right, the Cat Putsch, a little bit later on. And the political turmoil in Germany, there's assassinations. It's absolutely nuts. You didn't really want to be a German politician at this period of time. There were 356 politicians murdered by nationalist groups in those early years. 356 by right-wing national groups. Walter Rathenau, R-A-T-H-E-N-A-U, he signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk against Russia. He was killed in 1922. The most famous one of them is a guy called Erzberger, E-R-Z-B-E-R-G-E-R, Erzberger, very famous. He was murdered in 1921, and he was the dude that signed the Treaty of Versailles, and people hated it for him, particularly the nationalists, the right-wing nationalists. He was murdered. Of those 356 politicians murdered by nationalist groups, no right-wing murderer was ever convicted or executed. Not one. 10 left-wing ones were, though, the communists or socialists. That just goes to prove the fact that the courts and the judges were predominantly right-wing supporters and let off the right-wing nationalists. So that's not a particularly good situation to be in for Germany, but it wasn't their biggest issue. The biggest issue was the economy. Essentially, Germany was bankrupt after the cost of the First World War. 4 years, huge war, massively expensive. But then the Treaty of Versailles was signed, and as I'm sure you know, Germany lost a lot of territory, particularly its coal fields. And it's really good stuff on the west side of Germany. And also reparations. £6.6 billion of reparations to be paid by Germany to the victors, France, Britain and America. That was 2% of Germany's annual output. It was supposed to be paid in annual instalments every year, the first of which was 1921, and it was £50 million paid. Now, in 1922, nothing was paid. Germany said that we can't really pay it, it's too much, can we renegotiate? And France and Belgium weren't very happy about that because they'd suffered horrifically in the First World War and they wanted their reparations, as they were legally entitled to by the Treaty of Versailles. All right. So, in January 1923, the French and the Belgian soldiers entered the Ruhr, which is on that western side. It's the big industrial part of Germany, as they were perfectly entitled to do. Absolutely legal. It's not an invasion. They're allowed to do it. If Germany defaulted on its payments, France and Belgium could go in. And they did. And they took to take raw materials and the resources instead of reparations. So that's not particularly good for the Weimar Republic. The German reaction, the Chancellor at the time, Ebert, said, look, we can't fight the French and Belgians, sorry, we can't do that. So we need to do something called passive resistance. That means you're going to resist, but you're not going to do it violently. So you're going to go on strike. Okay? You could smash up a couple of machines and things like that so that they can't take them or use them, but you don't fight the Belgian and French troops. Now the French and the Belgians were not particularly happy about this because they were entitled to this reparations, this production. But their treatment was particularly harsh. I think they killed over 100 workers in protests, and they expelled over 100,000 workers from that Ruhr region. And they brought in their own workers from France and Belgium to work in the factories and the coal fields and stuff, and to produce stuff to take away. Now, the result was disastrous for Germany, absolutely disastrous. 80% of Germany's coal output was from the Ruhr region, which the Belgians and the French now occupied. Now, huge number of factories in there, And obviously, because of passive resistance, the workers weren't working, so there was loads of unemployment in the Ruhr. Now, then what happened was Germany got into a bit of debt and a massive shortage of goods. And as a result, government income, the money the government was getting, dropped. Now, politically, that was also an issue, not just economically, but politically, because the Germans resented the French and Belgians coming in and occupying their country and just taking their stuff. And they expected their government, the Weimar government, to deal with it. And they blamed them for not stopping this occupation. But that's a bit unrealistic, to be honest, because, well, if you remember the Treaty of Versailles, the German army was reduced to 100,000 men. It's tiny. The French, on the other hand, had 750,000 men. So the Weimar Republic certainly couldn't have stopped this. Now, the biggest issue, though, of this French occupation of the Ruhr is something called inflation. Now, inflation's pretty cool, unless, of course, you're suffering from it, in which case it kind of sucks. So, inflation essentially means rising prices, things getting more and more and more expensive. All right. It's generally caused by a lack of goods or a lack of supply. If you're a GCSE economist, supply and demand, all right, you know what it's all about. Basically, because nothing was being produced in Germany, if you wanted to buy stuff, it became more expensive, and the government didn't have a lot of money because the French were taking it. The government needed money, so it kind of went, well, we can't earn it, so I tell you what, let's just print it. Let's print. And they churned out new money, which is great, because they could pay the reparations, and they could pay the war loans, and they could, so they owed like £2,200 million, but they could pay it off in their worthless marks, because they were just printing new money. And businessmen paid off all their debts and their loans, which was perfect. But as the German government started producing more and more money, there was more and more money in circulation, the prices rose. And as prices rose, so did wages. The problem with that is, then the government needed to print even more money. So they did. And then because there was even more money in circulation, prices rose, and so did wages. So the government had to produce even more money. And this just continued. And that then became hyperinflation, like extreme inflation. Okay. Now, it's well worth knowing a few little facts and figures to illustrate this point in your answers. Easiest one to remember: loaf of bread in 1919, 1 mark. Loaf of bread 4 years later in 1923, 100,000 million marks. Okay. 1 UK pound, 1 fine British pound, was worth 20 marks in 1919. In 1923, 1 British pound was worth 20 billion marks. Just fairly hyperinflation. Now, extreme inflation. Now, the result, look, was that wages had to be paid twice a day. You got paid twice a day because money was becoming worthless throughout the day, losing its value. You need to take a wheelbarrow to work to carry your money home, because like a loaf of bread, 20 billion marks. They produced all these new notes, like the 20 billion mark one, the 100 billion mark note. And if you were joining a queue for a shop, the price of the things you were queuing to buy rose whilst you were queuing. Apparently, you paid for your dinner before you ate it, because by the time you'd finished it, it had got more expensive, which is fairly nuts. All right. Now, so that's the first result: wages and inflation and its effect. Second effect of this hyperinflation was the shortages of goods. Look, no one wanted German marks because they were useless and worthless. So Germany couldn't pay for anything it wanted importing into Germany. So there was a huge shortage of food and goods, obviously going to make the Weimar Republic unpopular with the Germans themselves. Thirdly, the group that suffered the most are the middle class. And those are the guys who've got some savings in the bank. They've been squirreling money away, putting a little bit away every month, like you all should, and they put money into pensions. And then, suddenly over 10 years of their life, they've saved 100,000 marks, which was loads. Like 1919. 1923, 100,000 marks. I wouldn't even buy you, wouldn't buy you a loaf of bread. So you've lost everything. They then stopped supporting the Weimar Republic because they'd lost everything, and the Weimar Republic couldn't solve the issue. All right. I mean, the money was so worthless that people were lighting fires with it because it was cheaper than buying the wood for the fire. They were wallpapering their house in the notes because it was cheaper than wallpaper. They were making kites and toys, and like the German version of Lego blocks wasn't Lego blocks, it was piles of billions of marks wrapped in elastic bands that you could build a little castle out of. It was absolutely chaos. Now in 1923, this is the absolute peak of this crisis. The Weimar Republic, the government cannot sort the issue out. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. They're losing the support of everybody. And suddenly this guy comes along, Stresemann. Now, he is awesome, really good. I'll do a separate video on him because he's so important. So, 1923, year of crisis, hyperinflation caused by Germany's failure to pay reparations and the German occupation of the Ruhr. And that led to Germany printing more money because it didn't have enough, which led to hyperinflation, which led to even a loss of support for the Weimar Republic. Okay, hope that helps.